yeah, it's a bit late. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back after what I hope to be a very safe and fun summer for you and your family. This is actually our first meeting since the summer, and I have a very brief report from as the chair. But before we do that, I want to welcome Nicole Cormier, who's our brand new consultant. She's also known as the new Bernita, but she will distinguish herself. She's got a lot of experience in this field, and I hope that we'll get to have a really great working relationship with her. In the brief conversation I've had with her as we reviewed the agenda earlier this last week, I can tell you that she is extremely skilled, strong advocacy, clear communication, and someone who I'm really looking forward to working with. So welcome, Nicole. Yeah. So just going through, actually what I should ask is, are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? No? Okay, seeing none. Let's go through the agenda review, if I may. Actually, is there confirmations of the minute? Can I have a mover to confirm the minutes of the last meeting? Thank you, Monica. Okay, all in favor? That is passed. There is a list of speakers here, and there's some communication that should be attached. Some of you would have received it over the leading up to the meeting. So let's just go through the agenda to see if there's going to be any items that are to be held. So obviously, number one is the chair's report. I will go through that. Item number 4.2 is the bylaw harmonization and guidelines for sidewalks, cafes, and marking displays in Toronto. We have a staff presentation, so that will be held. Item number 3 is the cycle track design and accessibility for 24 Wellesley Street. There is a registered speaker, so we will hold that down and we'll have a discussion. And item number 4 is a review of the recruitment process for the new term of the Disabilities Access and Inclusion Advisory Committee. That is our new name, and there will be some information provided by Nicole, and she'll be speaking to that shortly. Item number 5, we're going to hold for another staff update, and this is the review of the City of Toronto Accessibility Symposium. Lots of good information coming out. A date has been held. Item number 6, there's it's about Canada Post community mailboxes, and there's a letter here from the Vice President of Government Relations and Policy, Canada Post. Just as a backgrounder and a refresher, you will remember that we were asking for an update on how Canada Post is going to be deploying their community mailboxes and the impacts it would have for those living with disabilities. We did ask them, invite them to come and present to this committee. They declined, but rather what they did was they sent us a lot of information that we could have generally found on their website. So that's what we have, and if there's if there's no one holding it, then what we can probably do is receive this for information, if there's no comments. Okay, can I have a mover to receive this for information? Okay, Yin, thank you. Oh, yes, of course, I apologize for that. That was my oversight. Okay, so let's start with so we move to adopt the item number 4.6, move to receive rather. And I'll begin again with a round of introductions. It's City Councilor Kristen Wong-Tam, the chair of the committee. And on my left,
Nicole Cormier, accessibility consultant. Stephanie Osario. Monica Winkler.
Mike Layton.
Janice Dix.
okay, and we are also supported by staff who are sitting outside of our horseshoe. Should we go through the staff who are in the room? Okay, so why don't we do that? The staff who are here to support our committee, please identify yourself.
I am Matthew Cowley. I work in the City Clerk's office.
Tina Skanaraja in the Councilor's office.
Klaus Lehman, City Planning.
And as well as Councillor Carroll, who has just stepped in and with a big mug of coffee. Welcome, Councillor.
Yes, as a TTC commissioner, we don't have our low-floor streetcars. I'm still short 141, but we got this nifty mug.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ian. Thank you. So we're going to start with just a quick chair's report. I'll tell you that there was not, obviously, advisory committee meeting over the summer. You would know that because you would have been in attendance. I was able to attend the TTC Public Forum on Accessible Transit on September 16. This was at the Enbridge building. And Councillor Carroll was also there in her capacity as TTC Commissioner, as well as one of the members of our advisory committee. I thought it was a really well-attended meeting. It was live stream. The room was absolutely packed, and there were some really insightful, very thought-provoking comments. And I think that those who are sitting at the head of the table, sort of managing the TTC staff and executives, got an earful. But in the most respectful way. And I don't know if Councillor Carroll, since you were also there, I don't know if there's any members who also like to speak to that. You can share some quick insights.
Well, I just wanted to compliment the ACAT committee from that is always present at TTC committee meetings, because they pushed that this should happen every year, that it should be a big thing, and that both they and the commission, through their staff capacity, would work on building the attendance. And they actually do a huge amount of work to make sure that there's a build to it. So, you know, a lot of people were remarking on how many more people there were than last time, and that all of their issues on how they would build it, that they should be providing you know, special programming on Wheel-Trans to make sure that people were getting there for the night. You can't have a meeting like that and then create impediments within the transit system to getting there. And so compliments to both the staff and the committee, because they really work together to work out, particularly Sue Davidson worked to work out all the issues, so that if they wanted to put everybody all in one place, and they're now at the point now where they have to rent the Allstream Center because it's the only thing big enough to handle them all. And so, so it is a building sort of one-stop shop once a year, where I think all but three commissioners of the commission were in attendance, either for the open house when they could do a lot of one-on-one, or for the whole event. And that's pretty good coverage. You know yourselves, when you go to lobbyists or to have these events, you'll get one or two, or you'll get just the members of this committee. But to have that many of the commissioners, including Commissioner Heisey, citizen member and vice chair, means that a lot of the stuff that was taken up is going to get acted on, and in a reasonable time frame.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I also want to just say that part of today's discussion and agenda will actually include Nicole providing more information on the recruitment process as we reconstitute this committee at the end of this year. And of course, she's going to encourage all of you to reapply. Looking forward, this week City Council will be convening and sitting down over the days of September 30th, October 1st, and most likely October 2nd. It's very rare that council meetings are any shorter than 3 days now. Council will discuss the regulations of, the council will discuss the regulations of taxis, limos, and Uber as part of the ground transportation review report. And I can assure you that some of the key principles guiding my decision-making, and I suspect the decision-making of the other councillors who are sitting in this committee, will be the requirement of accessibility and the regulations that pertain to accessibility for new taxis as we go through the debate. We don't know what's going to happen. That's pretty clear. It's going to be a contentious issue. And I would encourage all of you to go onto the city's website, take a look at the items, because if without saying too much more, I think accessibility, the green standards of fleets have got to be guiding principles, and it should be level playing field in some way. So that's probably my briefest reports to date, and we're going to now move ahead to our second item. And the second item is our staff report. Oh, sorry, is there a motion to receive the chair's report? Okay. Stephanie, thank you very much. So we're going to be hearing from staff, bylaw harmonization and guidelines for sidewalk cafes, marketing displays in Toronto. You have the floor.
Thank you. So I'm here today with Hamish Goodwin from Municipal Licensing and Standards. Between Hamish and myself, I'm from Transportation Services, Public Realm Section. We are co-leading the Toronto Sidewalk Cafe and Manual and Bylaw update. From our perspective, it's quite timely. The manual itself, the earlier version of it was created in 1989, and the different bylaws still exist from the former municipalities of Toronto. So these are some of the last bylaws that are updated and harmonized as part of, sorry.
If you can just pull the microphone
Sure,
towards
absolutely.
yourself. Yeah.
Is that better?
It is for me.
Okay,
I don't know
wonderful.
for anyone else in the room.
So between an outdated manual and a number of different bylaws that require harmonization, it's a very timely opportunity to take the two aspects of cafe design and management and meld them into one. So we are now partway through the process, most of the way actually. About a year ago, Olga, who was working on the bylaw portion at that time, and myself came to the former Disability Issues Committee and presented some early findings of a review, a jurisdictional review that we did, and some early suggestions as how we would proceed with the design of cafes, and in particular, how we would address different accessibility issues that were flagged as part of our review. So again, going back to some of the earlier information we presented to the committee back a year ago, the manual really has two purposes, and it really is design focused. So it describes the requirements for the design of outdoor cafes, sidewalk cafes. It ensures also that sidewalks are functional, well-designed, and meet the needs of all users. And those are very key points for transportation services and MLS. The manual applies to all sidewalk patios within the public right-of-way, so it doesn't include private patios and rooftop patios. And the manual itself is subdivided into some basic categories. They have required design criteria, recommended, and then optional design criteria. So that's a sense of how it's ordered. The manual is closely related to the bylaw. The bylaw is the piece that regulates and gives us teeth to the different provisions. And then the manual provides a supportive function by providing that extra bit of design guidance and also trying to drill down into those design features that are important to cafe design. So again, we did a project scan. This is, again, about a year ago. One of the things that really struck us when we started our review is that other cities have been doing the same kind of process. So we're not unique in the sense of trying to develop sidewalk cafe guidelines and sidewalk design standards simultaneously. And other big cities such as Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, and New York have successfully balanced the concept of a vibrant cafe environment with pedestrian-oriented sidewalks. And indeed, if you look at other cities, in terms of their ability to provide for a minimum pedestrian clearway of a certain width and a straight clearway and one that is unobstructed, in many ways, we actually lag behind a lot of major North American jurisdictions. So the chart I have up right now shows ranges in the minimum pedestrian clearway of anywhere between 2.4 meters for Vancouver and New York, up to 4.6 for San Francisco, and up to 6.5 for Ottawa. We have a policy context that supports the concept of straight, clear pedestrian clearways of minimum width. Some of our policies that support that include the Toronto Accessibility Design Guidelines, Vibrant Streets, the Toronto Green Standard, and in fact, a lot of the bylaws that exist today in Toronto protect for a 2.1 meter minimum pedestrian clearway width. And in fact, when people walk down the street today, I suspect a lot of members of this committee already understand some of the issues that face pedestrians on sidewalks. Narrow pedestrian clearways. In many instances, pedestrians are forced to weave around obstacles in the sidewalk, including sidewalk cafes. Busy sidewalks on places like Bay Street or Queen Street or King Street. And in particular for this project, encroachments such as A-frame signs or umbrellas or tables and chairs that intrude on the pedestrian clearway. And I think those issues in particular for this committee are good ones to raise at this time. Again, we went to the stakeholders, cafe stakeholders and members of the community on this issue a year ago, and we heard some things that were quite similar in their theme. I think everyone really understood that sidewalk cafes are important to the city. They add a certain vibrancy. We heard loud and clear as well that, again, sidewalk design is really, really important. Clear, unobstructed clearways are important, and those should be prioritized against the private interests of cafe owners. Having said that, there was a lot of tension between, I think, members of the public and disability advocates in the creation of those clearways and the resultant, I think, imperative then to look at the cafe design and potentially pull that cafe back in certain locations. So definitely business owners are really concerned that their operations would suffer from that. So that was one of the tensions that we tracked earlier on. So just going through the manual quickly, and again, I recognize we have a limited time here. The objectives of the manual really remain unchanged from a year ago when we presented. The manual really is there to help people understand the bylaw and provide additional guidance to the planning and designing of sidewalk cafes. So it's really a clear language interpretation of the bylaw. The second point is safety and accessibility. That's a really important aspect of this. Design excellence, again, we want to make sure that the design of cafes is high quality and enhance the sidewalk experience. Cafes must be flexible. And finally, the cafe manual is there to help people interpret the application process and navigate through it. Of those 5 objectives, flexibility and safety and accessibility are the most important, and our job is to balance the two. So the manual provides a great deal of flexibility to cafe and patio owners now. We're offering different cafe options. We're offering the option to use neighboring frontages to expand the cafes if the neighboring business allows it. On local streets, the clearway requirement can be reduced to 1.7 meters. We're relaxing fencing requirements, so there's more of an emphasis now on things like planters versus fixed fencing. And then there are some operational changes that MLS are looking at to streamline the application process. So for those pieces, which I think are really wins for the cafe owners, we are insisting that safety and accessibility are in the forefront of the design of cafes. So again, we're pushing for straight pedestrian clearways of minimum 2.1 meters in width. They need to be straight again we've heard through the consultation process that if they weave, it creates a number of issues for people with different disabilities. And in some cases, a wider pedestrian clearway will be required on busy streets like King or Queen or Bay Street in the downtown core. Those are the foundation pieces of the manual. The manual is divided into 5 sections: sidewalk design, cafe design, element selection. We have some case studies at the end of it that show people how to pull it together for their own section of street, and a cafe application tool. The manual goes through a number of design principles. It goes through a number of different cafe types. We have the frontage cafe, which is a typical traditional one in the city. We have a new one called the small frontage cafe, which happens a lot illegally right now, but what we want to do is formalize it, but still make the application process very streamlined. Flankage cafe is one that you see a lot of today on the side streets. We're introducing a new one called the curbside cafe, which is cafe activities right at the edge of the curb and in the furnishing and plantings zone. We're introducing a parklet cafe type, which you see a lot of in San Francisco and Vancouver. And of course, you can combine these cafe types. You can mix and match the elements. The manual goes through site design requirements and tries to display them in a graphic way to cafe applicants. This is a slide that I'm going to dwell on here for a few minutes. The manual interlaced through the whole manual are accessibility design requirements. What I've done in this one page of the manual is tried to pull them all into one location. So this page shows the concept again of the pedestrian clearway that's straight and sufficient width to accommodate pedestrian movement, but it also looks at the different elements that were raised earlier in the process by accessibility stakeholders. And these are design guidance pieces to help patio owners actually design fencing and place planters in a way that people with different disabilities can navigate around in a safe manner. So for example, on this diagram, the planters are shown outside of the pedestrian clearway so people don't knock into them. We're encouraging people to put them, for example, on the inside of the fence instead of the outside. They need to be at least a couple feet high. I think we're saying 2.5 feet high so that people can see them as they're navigating down the sidewalk. And another example, a final example would be on the leading and trailing edges of the patio. Instead of having them open, they would be some form of barrier. So if you're walking down the street with a cane and you're navigating, you can actually encounter one, and then it becomes the landmark by which you navigate around the patio. So we're looking at some design guidance pieces like that. The manual goes through different elements. And then again, there's a section that helps people pull all the pieces together and apply them to their sidewalks. Now, all of this information is available on the accessible presentation, but just for the purposes of this session, I'll just have to go through them very quickly. Application process, again, the manual provides for some cues in terms of how an applicant would develop their application and get through the process. In terms of next steps, the transition from an old sidewalk design where you have narrow constricted sidewalks that weave into a type of sidewalk that has a much better situation for pedestrians isn't going to be easy, and it really will need to be design-based. So what we're proposing is a transition strategy that it will be dealt with over a few years, and we're looking at doing things like developing pilot projects and street designs where we can try to create consolidated cafe design where all the cafes do one consistent thing down the street. And then we'll need to secure enough design resources to help all the different stakeholders get through that design process and make sure that the patios that are not in compliance right now become compliant. Finally, we'll need to develop a pedestrian clearway tool that actually indicates on what streets we should have wider clearways as well. So that's where we're at right now. The manual and the bylaw are being finalized at the moment. We're still doing a fair bit of consultation this week and next to support that process. The design manual will be going through PWIC for review, and the bylaw will be going through the Licensing Standards Committee on November 26th. They are both tracking then together to City Council on December 6th. And definitely, if there's any interest in making deputations, we'd be happy to see that. Thank you.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much for that full report. I recognize that we got the short version, the condensed version. Are there any questions from members of committee? If you can just put up your hand. I see Yin, and I also see Tracy. Yin, you want to go?
I heard you mention 1.7. I thought the minimum is 2.1, so the 1.7 width applies to what?
The 2.1 meter minimum would be on main streets, arterials and collectors. So the 1.7 would be on the local streets. And the rationale is where we typically see the high pedestrian volumes are on the main and collectors. So the local street, for example, would be where a typical flankage cafe would be adjacent to a residential area.
I guess I'll just ask my two questions. I'm wondering if we already realize that we're behind other cities in our width, why can't we enlarge instead of going for the minimum, even 1.7, why can't we aim for 2.4? And the last one is I'm still not clear which parts are required and which one is kind of recommended. And then finally, the kind of enforcement, so we have all these new guidelines or bylaws, what is the enforcement methods?
Okay, good questions. So the approach that transportation is taking is to apply clearway widths where they're most useful. So on the residential streets, with fewer pedestrians, the 1.7 we feel is sufficient for passage of pedestrians. But when we get onto the main streets where we're seeing the larger volumes, that's where we would be looking for the enhanced clearways to manage those extra people walking down the street. So we're reducing it in that one instance, but generally we're looking at enhanced for the majority of the streets of where you'd find cafes. In terms of the second question, Hamish, did you want to answer that? Or did you want to follow up on that one in particular?
I can jump in. I'll just introduce myself because I missed the introductions earlier. My name's Hamish Goodwin. I'm a Senior Policy Officer in Municipal Licensing and Standards. Thank you to the committee for having me this morning. You had a question about why are we having the minimums and how the minimums will be enforced, as I understand it. So,
why are we not aiming for a wider one to even catch up to the other cities, and then enforcement? Yes.
Sure. Okay. So just to build off what Chris mentioned, I think one omission that didn't come through in the presentation is that the minimums will be embedded within the bylaw, but in addition to that, there will also be a clause which indicates that the city can request or can require greater than the minimums be provided on a case-by-case basis.
So, I would say on average, on balance, you're going to see the pedestrian clearways straighten and widen based on existing conditions. I think you'll see a few instances where we will have the 1.7, but largely we'll see a move towards wider, straighter clearways.
On the issue of enforcement, as with most enforcement in the city, it is primarily driven by complaints, so it's done on a complaints basis, and that's a common practice that continues. Other tools that are out there as an option are public education, and certainly as part of the implementation of the bylaw, we would be doing a public education campaign to make sure people are aware of the new bylaw requirements. And then following that, there will be opportunity to do so-called blitzes where there's an opportunity to go out to problem areas and just educate the business operators and to help bring them into compliance.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker, Tracy, or questions?
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you as well for coming to this committee under its former name earlier to get some input. And it's certainly a pleasure to see so much of that input incorporated into the materials that we received for the meeting today. I support Yin's comment around the smaller area. When you listed all the cities, 2.4 was the next lowest. Like, I don't think we want Toronto to be at the bottom of the pile all the time. And I also think about clearances can vary with weather, right? If there's snow piled up, that 1.7 will very rapidly make it impassable for someone with a mobility device and perhaps someone with a service animal or using a cane. So I think that's something to consider if it's the day for recycling and garbage pickup. There's other things out there too, which can encroach on that roadway. So I think that would need to be considered. And finally, I just wonder, you indicated you were going to work with business improvement associations, the BIAs and so on, to come up with a plan. Do you have a target date in mind for when you would like all of this to be done?
To be honest with you, we don't. We haven't settled on a date yet.
Okay. I think it would be good if there was, an outlying target date that people were aiming for. It would just keep awareness going. It would keep pressure on businesses, or otherwise it'll just fade into the misty, murky past, and we may not get to where we want to be with an accessible city.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have Melissa and then Councillor Carroll.
First, I just want to echo what Tracy and Nina were saying, but also, I think we need to be very careful that we're not setting pedestrians and cafe owners up in a situation that may become adversarial. Because I think some of that already exists, particularly in smaller neighborhood areas. Say if you have somebody that with a disability that lives in, say, in an area that happens to have a lot of these cafes, struggling to get around day by day, as a person who's commuted through those areas quite a bit, you do get the looks, you're aware that you're an inconvenience in that space, let's just say. And I think, particularly if we're setting up things in spaces where different areas have different levels of compliance, and it's set up on a complaint basis as well. We're not setting this up in a way of making our community better, but we're making exceptions for certain people still. And I think some of that, I think we need to be very careful about how we approach that. Particularly if we're asking disabled people in their communities to make complaints about business owners in their area. I think the likelihood of people doing that is pretty small, unless they're really upset about a particular situation, in which case you're probably only going to get a certain demographic of people who feel comfortable doing that. I think the approach you want to take is to look forward, to push for the best and say, if you can't do that, well then, okay, do this in the meantime. But to position it as you're making a specific accommodation for a specific group of people and asking them to make complaints, I don't know if I'm being clear what I'm getting at here, but I think we're setting people up for an adversarial situation.
So I think what I would say, this seems like a two-part piece to me, that the transition where we look at the design of sidewalks and we try to squeeze good cafes and good sidewalks out of it. I think that can become a collaborative process where we design out some of the problems we have today. I think that's a good point you're raising. The complaint piece, Hamish, it's more if, for example, a cafe owner sticks an A-frame sign out into the clearway, and if I'm correct.
I mean, there's more than 700 cafes out there in Toronto East York alone, so it's a challenge definitely to be on top of it on a day-to-day basis. Certainly, there's an opportunity there to address the common issues, infractions such as A-frame signs, I think, through public education tools. But when it comes down to enforcing on an individual case-by-case basis, I think that's it's a bit of a workload challenge there. But I certainly hear what you're saying in terms of the process that's relying on.
I think people are already, oops. Sorry. People are already, the complaints for A-frame signs, that's already in place, right? If there's an A-frame that's not where it's supposed to be, people can already complain about that. And as far as we've heard in this committee before, that hasn't worked out very well. So I'm just wondering how this would be different, considering we're talking about a much bigger situation.
Sure, I mean, it's true. The A-frame sign bylaw, I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down on that. That's a separate bylaw. I acknowledge there's problems with it. Perhaps as a further implementation of this project, we can then move on to addressing that bylaw. There are a number of ways that can be improved. Back to the issue of complaints in general. There's opportunities to, I mean, it's really done centrally through 311. It's not the case that you have to kind of direct a complaint to a specific bylaw or phone number, for example. So I think in that sense, it's set up to be done in a central manner. Doesn't it? Okay.
I think we need to perhaps look at more approaches that don't rely on individuals to make complaints. Because, for example, if I'm going down the street and I happen to come across an area that doesn't meet the criteria of the bylaw, I'm going to think about that at a time, but by the time I get home, I've moved on with my day. So unless something particularly repeatedly happens to you, I don't think most people would follow up with that process. Maybe something more community-based, like something working with city councilors to do community charge. I don't know, but I think there's other strategies there that could be looked at on a community level.
So beyond A-frames, I'll just quickly jump in there. And beyond A-frames, I think the biggest challenge is with the pedestrian clearway, making sure that there's that sufficient movement, space for the movement of pedestrians. Under the current bylaw, there is a practice whereby that minimum bylaw, which is 2.1 right now, can be reduced through an appeal process to community council. So there are instances where the minimum pedestrian clearway is reduced through that process. So there's an opportunity in the bylaw that we're reviewing right now to re-examine that process and think about the value as a city we place on the pedestrian clearway and whether or not we want an accessible city and whether or not that existing process is one that we want to keep or think about another way of securing that space for all pedestrians.
Great, thank you very much. Councillor Carroll, and then Stephanie.
Yes. First of all, I'm wondering if you can comment on, it is true that we're going with a lower measurement here, but we're on the low side, I should say. But there is also some of the cities that have a very wide clearance minimum. It's a wide clearance minimum, but under different conditions, and maybe you want to speak to that. Like some of the wide ones, there's one city that's Boston I've been to, where it's a really wide clearance, but it doesn't have to have a fence around it. So now you start to have a problem. Part of the enforcement is, hey, that guy snuck a couple of extra tables in because it's really warm this weekend, and I got to go and enforce because they're oozing out into the clearance. Some have, I haven't been there, but I understand San Francisco has a really wide clearance, but you can have fixtures in the middle of the wide clearance. So our clearance, while it's on the low side, if someone came forward and said, I want a sidewalk here and I want you to vary it because I'm a little short, you're saying we have flexibility on some things. I think I understood you to say this, but on other things, such as if there's a sidewalk tree and a planter there, that's the line. You can't start to encroach on those types of limitations. The 2.1 is 2.1 is 2.1. So it's not from the store to the sidewalk for the whole length of the store. It's from the store to any obstruction. So a tree and a planter, a newspaper box that's affixed, stuff like that, that's where the measurement's gonna be?
Yes, so going to the historical patterns, you're correct. If you go to cities like San Francisco or Chicago, they have more to work with in the downtown area than we do, absolutely.
But they also allow, I understand, there can be a fixture in the middle of that clearance, not having nothing to do with the restaurant tables.
I don't know what the regulations are in terms of maintaining the clearway, but,
Yeah.
you know, again, when you walk down certain streets of Chicago, there's a width there to the sidewalk that we just don't have access to. So I think the trick is to look at those numbers in context. So, for example, Queen and King Street, because of the pedestrian volumes going through there during rush hour, you'd like to have a sidewalk that's generous, you know, maybe 3.7, but we just don't have the room there to do that. So you've got to adjust that target down to the context.
Right.
Yeah.
Boston, I was in recently, and there was no railing around sidewalk cafes. It was a nice wide sidewalk, but there was no railing. So I was still doing this around it, and I thought, if I was visually impaired and I was caning along there, now without the railing, I've got to cane patrons because they're oozing out into the sidewalk. So if I'm going to find my way through that, the enclosures, while they're more flexible at how you can provide an enclosure, there's still a form of enclosure, whether it's a design feature or a fence.
Yeah, so to the fencing proposals in the manual, instead of the fixed fencing, we're allowing now for a number of different types. So it could be planters or stanchions, which are the ropes. Could also be portable fencing, like you move around like you see in Chicago, or it could be in some instances simply dots that demarcate the patio. So those we have to be a little careful about. And there are some considerations in the manual about how you would design with those things in mind. And they're not suitable for everywhere. So they wouldn't be suitable for licensed cafes. In our jurisdictional scan, we found they were most successful on city streets or plazas in Europe where the volumes of pedestrians were less.
Right. Okay. So my last set of questions, and this is interesting from my experience. I feel when I'm looking at an application for a sidewalk cafe, I feel kind of like Switzerland, because there is no circumstance under which you would ever be applying for one in Ward 33, where I represent. I have nothing but malls in my ward, so there are no avenues or boulevards where you'd put one of these. But I am, as a politician, put in the position of deciding these at North York Community Council for the couple of councillors that have those applications. So we can fall prey to a plea from an applicant, oh, it's not a problem, it's an inch here and an inch there, and please provide a variance. So the big question is, we're going to put this in place. Now, when a person comes to community council and says, staff said no, but please say yes, politicians, we'll still have the power to do that. Will there be a section in your reports that puts the lens on it of, we're saying no because these are our measurements, but also here's what would happen to the differently abled if you say yes to this? Will that be clear in the report, that that's one of the reasons why you can't say yes to this today, politicians?
Sorry, just a question of clarification. Which report are you referring to, the harmonized
On any restaurateur who comes forward and says, staff said, no, I can't put a sidewalk cafe here, but I'm appealing to community council, please say yes. Will it be clear in the report to that community council? Here's the reason we said no, and part of it has to do with disability guidelines.
Okay, so Thank you. I think I understand the question. So we are still undergoing some consultations for this process, but the options we're putting out there for this issue are that the minimums would essentially not be appealable. They would the cafe operators would have to apply the minimum pedestrian clearway first, and then determine, following that process, what space is available for them, if any, to put a cafe.
So you're saying it won't even be appealable at all? They can't come to community council and throw themselves in front of 11 politicians who don't know the neighborhood?
That's one option we're considering. There would be other elements of the bylaw that would be appealable, as they are right now, such as related to the hours of operation, for example.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie? And I think Tracy has some follow-up questions.
I just want to get back to Melissa's point around the monitoring of cafes around being accessible. Without any kind of clear monitoring system, the laws will be not applied in many places. And it also puts then persons with disabilities again in the second-class citizen category. We have food inspectors who go into restaurants on a regular basis to give people green, yellow, or red, pass or fail kinds of measurements. And just food for thought, maybe that's something, I know it costs extra in resources and such, but just to kind of level the playing field, could we not maybe give some consideration to that, to have some kind of formal monitoring system?
Is there a response to that, or is that something that you take back and reconsider as you finalize your report?
Absolutely. I mean, we've certainly heard you, and we'll take that on board. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tracy?
Just something that occurred to me. What will happen, say there's, a building that has a ramp in front of it, and so there's a problem with the clearance. I'm aware this had happened with a restaurant on Yonge Street, and that was resolved when Canada Post agreed to move their mailbox, a few feet one way or the other. So I'm just wondering how existing ramps are being built in, because it would be ironic if we were telling people to take out their ramps in order to get the clearance that we wanted.
The manual doesn't specifically address issues of building access, so that's a separate issue that isn't covered off by the CAFE manual and bylaw. Having said that, there are provisions for cafe decks that are built into the manual, one of which would be for the parklet cafe type, and they could potentially be permitted as well as part of a frontage or flankage cafe. And depending on the configuration of the building, there may be a rationale or option to build in ramps as part of that structure.
So you wouldn't be planning to tell someone to remove an existing ramp so that the design would be working?
It's not governed by the piece that we're working on, so I'm aware of it as an issue. It's an issue that the public realm section has certainly been is very aware of and are part of that process. For the purposes of our council reporting, though, on the CAFE manual, that won't be dealt with through this process.
Yes, I think, is this the last question? Because I'm just being mindful of time. Okay, Yin,
Just one last suggestion, as I've mentioned in previous consultations, that if restaurants who have gotten a patio license to even display that and perhaps be required on the sign, our patio license, and please, if you have any concerns, call 311. So at least it's one way of helping people to report if there are concerns. So just like TTC, they do an audible thing, like if you don't hear the audible announcement, please call TTC to make the, so it's just some suggestion for enforcement.
Thank you very much.
okay, Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Layton, I didn't see you. Go ahead.
Just very quickly, it strikes me that on implementing some of these designs to ensure that the clearway is constant, not just in front of one or two buildings, but an entire street, we need to do really some re-examining on a street-by-street basis. We have a great tool for that, our business improvement areas, where most of these patios are. These are the very active, very vibrant streets. They're already organized and talking. Is there any effort being taken to do outreach through the BIA office or with the BIAs about saying, well, instead of having all your patios up against the front of your building where it is a clear way, why not move them into the furniture area where it's not so clear a way? And it allows us to protect a 2.1 without any deviation and along the length of the street, rather than having a piecemeal, one in front, one on the street, one in front, one on the street. That's never going to achieve what we want. So is there resources coming to help us do that work?
Yeah, maybe I can answer that. So you're absolutely correct. This is really a toolkit, and we need to figure out on the street how to apply it to the different contexts. So throughout both last year's consultation process and this one, we've engaged TABIA and the BIAs and economic development through Mike Major as well. From a staffing perspective, we're looking at resourcing to develop some pilot projects and some design plans that we could possibly implement as part of the rollout as well. We haven't yet set the relationship between the BIAs to the city on that. We certainly think on transportation services and that we can bring some resources to the table. We've heard from the different stakeholders that they feel that BIAs should step forward as well and show some leadership.
Well, I suspect if resources were applied to one particular project on one length of street and said, we're going to pilot moving all of your patios in one season all the way out to the street edge where it's sort of disjointed and disconnected. And if those resources would include partly some beautification efforts, I bet you we can put together a product that other BIAs were said, hey, wait a second, we want to be like them, and put it as part of the cost share program with the BIAs and allow us to give have an example that we can then use. I've got 11 BIAs, so you're welcome to come and do it in my ward. I do believe that Councillor Wong Tam has already done similar work, and she would also be an ideal person with a good reputation with her businesses to pull that off. So if there is an appetite for that and a little resources to actually pull it off, I'm sure we could find a willing participant.
Thank you.
Okay. I would like to just close the round of questions and perhaps move to motions or speakers. Anyone to speak to the item? Okay, Councillor Carroll.
I just have a little show and tell. I'm wondering, who is there? If I could turn on the audio, the overhead projector. Because my questions may have seemed like, what the heck is she talking about? There it is. This is in one of the cities that has the widest clearance. This is a coffee shop in San Francisco. And yeah, it's a wide clearance, but this is what I mean about, I tend to support our design guidelines because they are going to call for some division, some definition. I think the restaurant has chosen the perfect day to take the picture. Look, from the cloudiness of the picture, it looks like it's probably not tourist high season. In tourist high season, here's what happens. They have a 4-meter clearance, but somebody who wants to have a cup of coffee ties their dog up to that light post. Now, where's the dog? Somebody comes walking by and sees their friend and grabs a chair from the empty table next door and puts it on the other side of that table, and all the clearance is gone. And now you've got to get by the person who's sitting on the wrong side of the table, and as you say, excuse me, I can't get past you, you get the eye-level dirty look as he turns around and you're interrupting my coffee. He's not supposed to be sitting there. But the reality is, without the structure and the design elements around the area, that's what happens, even though it's a city with really wide clearance bylaws. So while we're at a minimum distance, I think on balance, we've addressed some of the issues that make it easier things that could happen on a busy Saturday during tourist season that I described, the MLS bylaw enforcement guy is obviously not going to show up at exactly that moment and say you can't sit there. And if you're paying for your coffee, I don't have any faith that the restaurateur is going to come rushing out and say, hey, you who just spent $8 for a cup of coffee, you can't sit there. So we have to build it into design, and that's why the balance of design features plus the sidewalk width we have to work with. I'm at the moment prepared to go along with our designs, because I think the 2.1 and the planter between the leg of that table and your clearway is probably easier for us to consistently enforce.
Thank you very much, Councillor Carroll. Anyone else to speak? No? Okay. I have a motion on this item. And according to our terms of reference, we'll have to send it to the executive committee, who will then request, hopefully, that this presentation provided by Chris Ronson, as well as Hamish Goodwin, be then presented to the Planning and Growth Committee meeting on November the 16th, 2015. This is actually a request from the Planning Growth Committee Chair, and I will be sitting on that committee, so I'll get to hear your presentation all over again. I just want to speak very, very briefly around what was presented today. I have, like Councillor Layton, a range of BIAs, and trying to achieve those vibrant streets means we want to encourage pedestrian activity. So that means whether it's roll-up windows, animated cafes, place-making strategies, all of that is something that we all embrace. And there isn't a single cafe type that's described, whether it's frontage cafe, small frontage cafe, flankage cafe, curbside cafe, and parklet cafe, that we haven't had in Ward 27. We piloted the very first parklet cafe in the city on Church Street, and we put the first curbside cafes onto through our Celebrate Young program in 2012. And again, we then created something more permanent in front of the Aura building at Gerrard and Young. So we've tested a number of these cafes, and I would say that what has always been a challenge for myself as a local ward councillor and someone who sits on the BIAs as an ex officio member by way of being a councillor in the area, is that there is the conflicting interests between accessibility and safety versus those of the private interest, which is to try to expand their cafes as far as they can to grab as much real estate, because it's an opportunity to sell beverages, it's an opportunity to sell food. So we have this conflict, and the convergence of conflict emerges in many cases when we don't have a lot of sidewalk real estate. So I think that while we continue to figure out how do we divide up our very limited sidewalk space, which is not wide at all, especially on Yonge Street, when you've got 42 million people walking up and down Yonge Street annually, the minimum requirement can't be 2.1, and it can't be 3. It can't even be 3.6. We're trying to achieve 10-meter wide sidewalks wherever we can now, and that means 6-meter wide sidewalks when you're not on the main arteries. The challenge for us is either we push the building back beyond their property line, or we take the curb lane. And this is the thinking I see is somewhat missing from this report, and this is why I think it should go to planning and growth, because we're not going to get wider sidewalks. So you have we're operating from a place of scarcity, and we've got limited real estate, trying to divide up all the different users, whether it's A-frames, signs, whether it's people who are moving through with strollers, as well as the elderly, as people with varying abilities, as well as trying to take into consideration the needs of the business operators. On top of that, we've got streetscape improvements, and those trees need to have lots of soil pits. They need to be deep and wide, and everything else you can think of, granite banners and what have you. That is a lot of competition for very little real estate. So if we don't create that shift of who are we building cities for and neighborhoods for, and it cannot be the commodification of sidewalk space only for private interests. And it cannot be that curbside parking has to be in every single BIA area in order for businesses to receive customers and service deliveries on the side, the curbside. There has to be a bigger, innovative thinking shift. So I want to commend staff for the report. I think it's a great place for us to start. It's the harmonization of those 6 bylaws was long overdue, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think you heard loud and clear from this committee that no one wants to be treated as a second-class citizen. Asking for people living with disabilities to constantly be the police and enforcement is not fair. And certainly I think that we can do better. I know that this report is going to go through licensing. It's going to go to, I forget the process, licensing, public works, and hopefully now planning. And I hope that when the final report comes to council in December, we actually see some language that gives the comments of this committee even greater consideration. With that, any speakers to the motion? Questions, the mover? No? Let's have a vote. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Just a procedural question. So does that kick in a joint meeting, or is it going to visit those committees separately and separately they give recommendations?
That is a question probably for the clerk to answer. The clerk said she will have to find out. Yeah. Yeah, the objective is just to get this report in front of as many committees as possible, recognizing there's going to be all sorts of stakeholder interests. Okay, so all in favor? Okay. Any opposed? No? Okay, that's carried. Thank you very much for your presentation. Okay, moving along, we have cycle track design accessibility regarding 24 Wellesley. There is one speaker registered to speak. Mr. Gord Brown, are you here? Okay. Would you like to come to the front of the room? Jacqueline, I'm going to ask you to, yes, you can set up. Yeah, thank you. Mr. Brown, if you'd like to come to the front of the room, you've got 5 minutes to make your deputation. Yeah, that's fine. We have this committee that is very easygoing and flexible. Okay, so we were going to run the clock for Jacqueline so she can set up properly, but
It's Jacqueline Hayward-Gulati. I'm the manager of the Cycling Infrastructure and Programs Unit at the City of Toronto's Transportation Services Division. And I'm here to speak to you today about a request that Councillor Wong Tam made through the Public Works and Infrastructure Committee, and some work that we've been doing to review the cycle tracks on Wellesley Street and Sherbourne Street for some of the issues that have been raised and some design improvements that, based on this review, that we can recommend. So the process that I'm going to go through is to provide you with a bit of background on the request, a little bit of background about cycle tracks and their designs, and the work that we've been doing to review the issue, some of our recommendations, and then I'm looking forward to a chance to hear your feedback so that we can incorporate that into a report back to the Public Works and Infrastructure Committee following this meeting. It's skipping through on me. I'm not sure why it's going through the slides on its own. So a bit of background on both Wellesley and Sherbourne Street. And it's still going through. My apologies. Not sure why it's advancing on its own. Let's see if I can get that to stop. So Wellesley Street previously had standard painted bike lanes, which were upgraded to separated bicycle lanes, which we refer to as cycle tracks. So I'll tend to use the term cycle tracks through this presentation. Council direction to make that upgrade was in July of 2011. There was a design and consultation process, very similar to an environmental assessment that took place throughout 2012 and 2013. And construction was completed earlier this year. For Sherbourne Street, it was also upgraded from painted bicycle lanes to cycle tracks with similar timelines in terms of council direction in 2011. Design and consultation took place in 2011 and 2012 for the section between Bloor and King Street, and following that for the section between King and Front. The section between Bloor and King was completed in 2012, and the section between King and Front is currently being constructed. Sherbourne Street is interesting because it has a few different types of cycle tracks that are relevant to our conversation today. Between Bloor and Gerrard, what you have is a bike lane that's at the street level, and it has a rolled curb that separates the cycle track from the travel lanes. Between Gerrard and King Street, the cycle track is at the sidewalk level, and it's either a full curb or it slopes down to the road. So it's a design consideration that was made based on the type of construction that was going on the road. The south section, because it was a full reconstruction of the road, we had the opportunity to make a sidewalk level cycle track, whereas the section north between Bloor and Gerrard, it was simply a resurfacing project, so the staff didn't have the opportunity to do as much changes to the drainage and the design of that section. So a different design was accommodated for. Throughout the consultation process for both of these streets, accessibility was certainly a design consideration, and I'm going to talk about the types of design considerations for cycle tracks further along in the presentation. But between conversations with Wheel-Trans and trying to understand where accessible loading was necessary, as well as members of the public, there are design considerations built in to some of the designs here on both Wellesley and Sherbourne. But what we're recognizing through some of the concerns that have been raised, particularly over the past year or so, is that we didn't always get it right, and that there are opportunities to tweak some of the designs, particularly to address accessibility concerns, but also to address some of the concerns from other users as well. Previously, it was advancing on its own, and now it doesn't want to advance at all. There we go. So earlier this year, staff received a request from Councillor Wong Tam through the Public Works and Infrastructure Committee that was received at the April 9th PWIC meeting, and it in particular asked staff to review complaints that have been received regarding frequent parking in the bike lanes and the separation conditions for both of these cycle tracks, drop-off and pick-up locations for Wheel-Trans and accessibility taxis, and constraints in terms of drop-offs along these locations, and drop-off and pick-up locations for other uses. So just general access to people's homes and businesses. The request asked staff to provide information about the complaints that had been received, to review these issues, and to report back on solutions and recommendations to remedy the conflicts here. So to provide you a bit more context about the type of cycle tracks, I described them earlier. When we have a reconstruction, there's a more major construction going on, and we have an opportunity to change the drainage where those storm sewers are and all of that. And so there are more opportunities for us to change the way that a bike lane can be upgraded. So I have three types of reconstruction of cycle tracks on the screen. On the far left is a cycle track that is it's at the sidewalk level, and it slopes down to the roadway, and it's quite useful for cyclists because it's permeable, that you can easily go around other cyclists or any obstruction, but it also is vulnerable to illegal car parking. The next type that's in the center is what you see on the section of Wellesley between Yonge and Queen's Park. This section where the cycle track is at the road level, and there is a full square curb in between the cycling facility and the road. This is similar to what you see on the north part of Sherbourne, except here that curb is square, whereas on the north part of Sherbourne the curb is more rounded. And the third type, the type on the left, is the south section of Sherbourne, and you'll see this in other areas when we go forward, is a cycle track that's at the same level of the sidewalk, where it's a little bit harder for cyclists to pass each other depending on the width of that facility. It effectively blocks vehicles from coming onto the facility, but there is sometimes an issue with pedestrians wandering into the cycling facility unintentionally. In the cases of road retrofit, where there's less construction work that's otherwise going on, a cost-effective solution for us to implement cycle tracks generally starts with paint. So the first three on the top are opportunities to introduce cycle tracks through the redesignation of existing vehicle lanes through paint. And so this is similar to what you see on Richmond, Adelaide, and Simcoe here in the downtown core. On the left is a buffered bike lane that has a paint-only separation. In the center is a bit of an upgrade from that, where there is a flexible plastic bollard in between some of those buffered areas. And on the far right is the cycle track separated by parking. So on Simcoe Street, you'll see some of this where there is an area for either parked vehicles or motorcycles to separate the cycle track from the travel lanes. And further to the bottom of the slide, there are two types of where you're using that buffer, but you're putting something other than a flexible plastic post in it. So you have curbstones. We haven't used this type of cycle track here in Toronto as of yet, but they use it quite frequently in Ottawa and Calgary, and we're thinking about this type of facility. And then on the bottom right, you see a cycle track separated by planters. We have introduced some of this as a pilot project on Simcoe and on Richmond. Now, what I wanted to draw your attention to is that we have had accessible loading concerns raised with some of these types of cycle tracks. So I'm going back to the reconstruction. The type on the far left is fairly permeable for accessible loading vehicle, whether it be a Wheel-Trans or a private taxi, to come into the cycle track. They are permitted to do so and unload within that facility. The center model that you see on, similar to Wellesley or the north part of Sherbourne, it does not allow for that activity because the curb is too big and the vehicles cannot kneel within the cycle track. The far right is quite amenable to accessible loading because you can easily deploy at that curb. In terms of the retrofit types of cycle tracks, they're still they do provide for accessible loading because where there are breaks in the separation, or there isn't a physical piece of infrastructure, either the flexible bollard, planter, or curb in the separation, a Wheel-Trans vehicle can enter the cycle track to unload. And we have been looking at some locations to provide for that activity. There's one location on Simcoe that we've had concerns raised, and we're looking at a place for vehicles to load, unload outside the cycle track and providing a curb depression so that that loading can happen for accessible users through the cycle track. So throughout the planning process, we're really learning about how cycle track design and accessible loading concerns can be accommodated. There isn't any specific design guidance in the AODA around cycle tracks other than to say that public spaces and exterior passive travel need to be accessible and barrier-free. So we're learning about how cycle tracks and accessibility interact. One of the main sources of feedback that we're looking to for this issue is from the TTC in terms of Wheel-Trans operations. So we're gathering information from them in terms of standards for making sure that locations that allow for accessible loading provide for both rear and side loading, have a buffer so that the ramp can be deployed, and allow pickup and drop off very close to the building entrance in the line of sight for the driver. We understand the operations of Wheel-Trans vehicles doesn't allow for the vehicle to kind of be parked around the corner and then bring somebody door to door, because that leaves the people who are in the Wheel-Trans vehicle alone and not attended to. So these kind of considerations mean that we need to think about the various vehicle types, both the Wheel-Trans vehicles, which there's a varying fleet, as well as taxis, adjacent uses. We need to think about existing driveways, side and rear entrances, and the constraints of available right-of-way width. So some roads where we introduce cycle tracks are wider than others, and you can provide for accessible loading adjacent to the cycle track, whereas in other areas, and I'll get into this in the next slide, there isn't the space to do that because a Wheel-Trans vehicle adjacent to the cycle track would be blocking the rest of traffic, which wouldn't be a safe condition. So throughout the design process for Sherbourne Street, I mentioned between Bloor and Queen, it's one design, and between Queen and King, it's another. The road width allowed for parking laybys to be integrated into design. And the main impetus for these parking laybys was to accommodate the high Wheel-Trans and accessible loading activity along this corridor. What we're finding challenges with, though, in this corridor that we've heard from Wheel-Trans that they're having issues with is that some of those laybys designed for Wheel-Trans loading are being used by other uses, and they're not able to get in and provide the service to the patrons. So one of the solutions that we are looking to recommend out of this process is to designate all or part of those laybys just for Wheel-Trans, accessible loading zones in those laybys, so that they can be used as they were intended. So that's the point that I mentioned there about the designation of parking laybys being considered as part of that process. In terms of Wellesley, there are two sections. I actually only included the one with the full curb on this slide, but we have between Yonge Street and Queen's Park Circle on the west side of Wellesley, we have that full curb that I mentioned, and between Yonge Street and Parliament, there's a buffered bike lane with the flexi post to provide the cycle track in that section. And for the most part, laybys were not possible due to the road width along this corridor. And throughout the planning process, accessibility points needed to be identified to be able to allow for loading and unloading. In one case earlier this year, which really I think kicked off the need for this review, we heard from many residents, probably about a dozen to 20 residents from 24 Wellesley, which is just just west of Yonge Street, that they did not have any opportunity for loading and unloading for Wheel-Trans vehicles at that location. In speaking with the staff that were involved in the planning process through that location, initially, it was felt that some of the laneways adjacent to that building would provide for sufficient loading, and it didn't have a high volume of Wheel-Trans pickup drop-off, so it seemed like that would be the right solution. But based on the feedback that we heard from residents in that area, that was not the cycle track with the full curb at their residence, at their condo building, was not working for them. So we went out and we did a site visit with members of the property management firm and the condo board and residents, some of whom were in wheelchairs, and did a site visit with them to understand the issues and why the laneways adjacent to that building would not be sufficient. And so as a result, since we were at the final stage of construction of this cycle track, we made a decision that we absolutely needed to accommodate Wheel-Trans pickup and drop-off and accessible loading at this location. So we removed about 20 meters of a curb that had been poured about 6 months prior to be able to allow for that activity to happen adjacent to that building. So we wanted to move quickly within the contract period of that construction to be able to make that adjustment. And following that, a report went to the Community Council, Toronto and East York Community Council, to designate that area as an accessible loading zone. And so that area is now signed and posted as accessible loading. It's intended only for Wheel-Trans and accessible taxis to use that space. And following the two meetings that we had on site, we had great feedback from the residents and the condo board at 24 Wellesley, indicating that this solution really met their needs, and it was a time that they felt that the city really came through on addressing the issues that they had. In terms of the next steps for our review of the various issues, we wanted to come to you today to seek feedback about the issues we're looking into, if there are any others we've missed, and whether you think the solutions that we're recommending are appropriate. And so I'll just go through some of them that are not specifically around accessibility. The issues of frequent parking in bike lanes and the separation conditions, we've been reviewing that through observation and documenting incidents of parking within the cycle tracks and bike lanes on Wellesley and on Sherbourne. And we've seen over time it has been reducing, and in some places we've put in additional flexi-ballers to reduce the the entry of vehicles into those spaces. We have gone and done a site visit with Wheel-Trans where we rode along in one of the Wheel-Trans vehicles along both of these corridors and understood which locations were challenging for them to have pickup drop-off and where we needed to make changes. In some cases, that is a change where, as I mentioned, looking at the signage for those lay-bys so that it's Wheel-Trans designated space within those lay-bys. But there were also some interesting solutions recommended around if you just took out one bollard here or there along Wellesley, east of Yonge Street, this would allow for Wheel-Trans loading and unloading, but not reduce the separation conditions of the cycle track. And the other idea that came forward through our consultation with Wheel-Trans was that in many cases, cyclists don't understand that Wheel-Trans vehicles are permitted to go into the cycle track, and they're quite mad and frustrated when they see that happening. So communication regarding that issue, we're thinking about a decal sticker on the back of the Wheel-Trans vehicles to indicate that, to watch for Wheel-Trans vehicles coming into cycle tracks, and they are permitted to do so. So that's one thing that we're working with the Wheel-Trans team on at TTC. The other issue that we have is that currently cycle tracks in our bylaw do allow for Wheel-Trans vehicles to go into the cycle track for loading, but not general accessible taxis. So that's not consistent with the bylaws for bike lanes. In bike lanes, any accessible unloading and unloading can take place. So we're going to propose a change to the cycle track bylaw to make it accommodate both Wheel-Trans designated vehicles as well as other vehicles. And finally, going forward, we will continue to look at the accessibility needs as we plan more cycle tracks and the expansion of cycle tracks in the city. And part of that is working with our colleagues in the accessibility part of the public realm unit and the pedestrian unit to understand how Complete Streets design approach accommodates both cycling facilities and accessible facilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. That was a very full and detailed presentation. I'm sure that that has sparked some interest, and there are probably some questions. I see Yin's hand go up, and Terry Lynn after that, and then Rahima. Yin, you want to go first?
Thank you very much for your very comprehensive presentation, but I'm surprised that I've been on this committee for a number of years, and I've never been heard of consultations, input from this committee, but also being part of the sight-impaired community. We are very concerned that, first of all, again, we have never been consulted, and this whole idea of raising the cycle lane to be on par with the sidewalk. I mean, for a blind or a sight-impaired person, how are we supposed to know where the cycle lane starts and also what's to stop them from coming into, so you can understand, previously there's a curb, sidewalk curb that I know if I step off the curb, there are vehicles, whether it's cycle cars or street cars, but if it's on the same, so I don't know if any consultation has been done with the sight-impaired community to get our feedback, because I see that as a real potential danger. And then secondly, to cross, when I cross the street, even just to get to the island of the streetcar islands or to cross the street, if there are cycle lanes that I am not aware of because I'm blind or sight-impaired, what's to stop them from hitting me, because they are silent for the most part. I can hear a car or a streetcar coming. I can't hear a cycle as well. And my husband has seen cyclists even just going fast and hitting just a regular person, not even sight impaired. So I really feel that pedestrian safety should be of primary concern, not just safety of the cyclists.
Thanks for your question. It brings up a couple of issues that I didn't raise in the presentation. Your point about designating the space between the cycling facility at sidewalk level and the sidewalk is really important. And I know that quite a bit of design work went into Sherbourne Street in particular for the tactile stones that separate the pedestrian realm from the cycle track. And so depending on the width of the section in between the the sidewalk and the cycle track available in the street, there are between, I would say between 400 centimeters and 600 centimeters of tactile stones that separate that space. And I don't know who was involved at that time. I apologize because I'm actually fairly new to the city. I started here in January, but I know in the planning process that the accessible, having that tactile difference, the distinction between the sidewalk and the cycle track was of utmost concern for pedestrian safety and particularly for those that are sight impaired. In terms of the bus stops location that you bring up, I do have a picture on the screen for those of you who can see, but I'll describe it. The design at Sherbourne is very similar to the design on Roncesvalles and the design that has also been mimicked on Wellesley, where the yellow tactile domes provide a distinction between where the stop location is at the back, the front of the bus, as well as between the place where the pedestrian enters into the loading area. And cyclists are required to stop, and there is signage to say that they are required to stop. There is a bylaw in place that says, just like stopping at the back of a streetcar, a cyclist is required to stop behind those yellow tactile domes. And we have seen improvements in compliance of that over time, but your point about the concern about safety is well taken.
Thank you very much. Our next questioner is Terry Lynn.
Hi there. I live in this immediate area, and I have some concerns that I know I've raised in a meeting that was probably over 1.5 years ago now. But I know just a bit up from that exact picture, there is the 410 Sherbourne Clinic that sees a lot of people, particularly with disabilities who are experiencing acute illness. There's also the CCAC Fast Center downstairs. And I'm mentioning that specifically because there's a lot of folks that are accessing that center that are using pretty high tech, as my acupuncturist pointed out, pretty high tech medical equipment. And they're not at their best. And when I go there, I'm not at my best. I've tried to be dropped off there a few times by taxi, and I was actually, there was a brouhaha between a taxi driver and a cyclist more than one occasion. But what I'm very curious about the 410 Sherbourne Clinic in particular is that if you go to Hospital Lane, which is just university and college area, in front of a medical facility, there are stickers that will say, walk your bike or walk your ride. And that doesn't exist at all outside of the 410 Sherbourne Clinic. And I think based on things that I've seen in terms of people that are quite unsteady trying to use their walkers, trying to get in, and then cyclists are coming in right at the same time, if that can't be like a more simple solution. Because I've been literally right there, like right in front of that that yellow space, and cyclists have taken me off my feet, kind of thing. So compliance is a bit of an issue. The other concern that I wanted to raise in speaking with Sandra is that right in front of about 390 Sherbourne, let's say, I won't reveal my address, but there have been a number of cyclists that have been hit over the summer, and it seems to be like a fairly dangerous cycle area. And I'm wondering if the city hears about, if the ambulance is frequently called to that area to get cyclists that have been hit, if that's been considered at all. Because I know that I cycle sometimes, and my cycling is in like a racing chair, so it is bigger. Like I'm a very responsible / careful person when I go out, and I never go out on my own. But it's a bigger situation than a standard bike, and I'm definitely not within a sight line of the like a motorist, that the same sight line that a bike would be. So I also have gadgets on my chair and such. But I feel like this, especially the 410 Sherbourne Clinic, like there's something needs to be done there. They have told me that they have talked to the city as a clinic in terms of their concerns. And yeah, some of these safety concerns that people are raising, I definitely concur that there are some additional issues that have been happening.
So can I just ask a point of clarification? So with, outside of the 410 clinic, are people riding off of the cycle track onto the sidewalk at that location? So because you mentioned using the Walk Your Ride decal. So is that what's happening, or is it conflict within the cycle track itself?
It's within the cycle track itself. Like, people are just continuing to cycle, and people are trying to like either access the clinic or leave the clinic. Yeah.
So the people are within the cycle track, like the people are walking into the cycle track while the cyclists are going through? Is that what you mean?
It's such that it can't be avoided.
Okay, we'll definitely
Yeah.
take a look at that as part of our review, because part of the reason to come to this committee was to make sure that our review was thorough and address the issues that people are concerned about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry Lynn. Rahima has some questions, followed by Stephanie.
Hi. Can you hear me? There's a cycle track in front of my home in this vicinity, and I'm a Wheel-Trans user. I get picked up in the middle of the road, down the street in the middle of the road. Cyclists have tried to slap me. They've taken their fist to the Wheel-Trans vehicles, and they've taken photos of the license plate. I'm thinking maybe these cyclists used to have license on their bikes. It's a good idea to put a sticker onto the vehicles, but I think you need a big signage, like on a lamppost, so it's clear and everyone can see it. Not that it won't obstruct anyone's views. And I agree with Terry Lynn, what she said. When I'm going to medical appointments and I'm not feeling well, I have to go halfway around the block. And in the winter, waiting for Wheel-Trans and the snowplow and all the ice, it's very difficult. So what can we do to ensure everyone's safety? Thank you.
Thank you for raising that concern in particular. I recognize the disrespect that I think that some of the cyclists in this city are incurring on other people, and unfortunately we can't control for everyone's behavior, but I recognize the feeling that creates. And I think that your idea about more permanent signage is something we can take a look at as well. Really, the intention about that, the decal and perhaps a sign, would be to make it clear that the Wheel-Trans driver, that you as a Wheel-Trans user, you're absolutely well within your right to be using that space, and that respect and courtesy is required. So that is something that, as part of the creation of these decals or signs, that we want to make sure that it gets it wide enough out there. So thank you for that idea about a sign more permanently. And in terms of the location and the winter, that's precisely why the issue about these lay-bys that are being obstructed by other users, we want to make sure that they're free and clear so that Wheel-Trans users and the Wheel-Trans vehicles can get into them, because then you get into situations where you're having to load in the middle of the street or around the corner, and understandably, particularly in winter conditions, that's not acceptable.
How would bikers feel if they got license and they got photos taken of their license and their behavior? You know?
The issue about licensing in
Safety.
particular has been reviewed, so I really am not going to speak to that issue today, but I recognize your requests about the signage, making sure that conveys what it needs to, and making sure the space is clear for loading to happen where it should.
Thank you.
Stephanie and then Monica. We're still in the round of questions, and Tracy.
Thanks very much for your thorough report. I think it's very educational. I just want to speak to Yin's point about the cycle tracks that are on par with the pedestrian sidewalks. If you go down to Queens Quay around Harborfront, that is a perfect example of the worst-case scenario. I was down there in the summer, high volume of tourism and people walking I think that pedestrians were not really clear that those were cycle lanes. So where the pedestrian part of the sidewalk was blocked because of a high volume of people, they would naturally tend to wander over to the cycle lanes. At the same time, the cyclists would then go around the pedestrians into the pedestrian portion of the sidewalk. And where you've got the tactile stones or whatever you call them, it looks beautiful. But I think that, again, tourists will look at that as more of a visual pleasantry rather than understanding this is supposed to indicate a divide between the two areas. And there's also a part where there is a set of lights where cars can go into a parking area at Harborfront. That is totally chaotic because people don't actually understand that there's a light, and when it turns red, cyclists need to stop and not go through the intersection, and the same with pedestrians. So might want to look at that as an example of where there could be some improvements, like a rolling, like you said, a rolling kind of cement thing in between the pedestrian walkway and the cyclist section.
Thanks for raising that. I didn't address Queens Quay in this presentation because the request through the Public Works Committee was specifically about Sherbourne and Wellesley, but we are actively working with Waterfront Toronto on some immediate sort of tweaks and changes to improve understanding of what the intended facilities are for shared space and where there's designated space along Queens Quay. But there also are some bigger changes in the works to make clear those interlocking stones that you're talking about, they don't have any kind of tactile difference between one place and another. So as a pedestrian, it's very easy to just continue to walk, and it feels like it's that it's still a space where you can walk even though you're really entering what is an intersection at that point. And so we're working with Waterfront Toronto to look at changes to that place where it looks like it's just a plaza, but it actually is, you're crossing both cycling traffic and in many cases turning traffic vehicles into parking lots. And the compliance of cyclists at those signals, we have seen some improvements. There has been some monitoring, but the police have been asked to assist with enforcement in that location as well.
Hi. A crazy thought came into my head as Rahima told us the story of cyclists whizzing by and hitting and punching and stuff. Crazy idea came into my head. Would it be an absolute impossibility to install arms on the Wheel-Trans buses like they have on school buses that would just block the cycling section? And that way no one could get by in that section?
That's not something that our unit, as part of Transportation Services Cycling Infrastructure, could propose. And at this point, Wheel-Trans was interested in the idea of using decals and signage. So that would be certainly a capital cost to be looking at arms and all of that. So I think we'll continue to work with TTC and Wheel-Trans team. If these decals and signs, if they help us get there, if we get the improvements that we're looking for, then maybe that's enough. It's a good idea to propose to them.
Because the problem is that cyclists have been treated like second-hand citizens for a long time in the city, and so they've developed quite an angry stance against a lot of things, of being doored, of being not allowed to be in traffic properly. They've given up on all sorts of rules because of that. And so either there has to be a huge public campaign explaining the rules of the road again, or it has to be more physical somehow. So just my thought.
Tracy.
Yeah, I appreciate that you've been talking with Wheel-Trans, and it sounds to me there's been particular emphasis on hospital and clinic access, which is important because a lot of people do go there. But just keep in mind that people can book a ride to go to any destination, and depending on their situation, if somebody is walking with a walker, they may not be able to go several doors down from their destination. And in the winter, depending on the conditions, like even if you have a motorized chair, that can be not possible. I think it's hard because the more you try to improve bicycle lanes, the worse it's getting. you know, for the rest of us. And I have real concerns about pedestrian safety in all the models that are presented.
Thank you very much, Tracy. If there are no more questions for Jacqueline, we'll actually ask our speaker to come to the front of the room. Okay. Gord Brown, come on up.
What I have is a presentation that has 1 minute of intro, 1 minute of closing, and I have 5 examples of issues that I think are of great interest to this population, to this committee. So it would take longer than 5 minutes to do justice to it. Alternatively, I can keep it to 5 minutes, and then people can ask me questions about what the other examples were. Not that I'm trying to plan a question.
I've already started your clock. So are you, that's fine. If you try to finish, you're probably not going to get it, but there might be some questions that the committee will ask of you as you deliver your presentation.
And Jacqueline, I wondered, I need to use that. Can I ask if you would please stop the clock until I...
Sure, when you're ready. Yeah, if you can just put it directly on top, it's coming up. I think Andy is working on that now. Okay.
IT Dave. How do I turn this? Or not, we'll rotate it one more time. Okay, great, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I'm very, very happy to be here. My name is Gordon Brown. I'm a resident of downtown Toronto. I love to walk and exercise for exercise and transportation. And as a caregiver for someone who has Parkinson's disease, I realize each and every day how blessed I am to be able to walk easily and confident around the city, and I realize that's not the case for everybody. For many years, I've been involved in a number of organizations and initiatives focused on improving active transportation in general, but the pedestrian experience in particular. I was thrilled when Council approved the Toronto Walking Strategy, saying the safety of pedestrians takes precedence over all other forms of transportation. But when I walk the city, I really have to ask if everybody got the memo. And in particular, I'm increasingly concerned that this principle isn't being reflected in recent cycling projects. And what I'm seeing is that risk is being transferred from cyclists to pedestrians, and there isn't really any conscious acknowledgement of that. I presented these concerns previously to the Public Works and Infrastructure Committee. I'm disappointed to see they haven't been included in Jacqueline's presentation, but I'm hoping at the end of this she'll simply do the right thing and add them in. There's a number of specific areas I want to focus on. This is Queen's Park West. My questions are, what do we do and how do we know? If you're a pedestrian or cyclist, what do you do when you get there and how do you know it? Basically, what you're faced with is a situation where when you come to the end of the crosswalk, you've got 2 lanes of bikes coming at you and no way to safely get into the park. Second one is one that a number of people have talked about, which is the accessibility access on Sherbourne. Yes, there is a lay-by. My question is, why would we not simply keep the bike lane going straight, have the cars cut across it as they do on every other entrance on Sherbourne Street, and allow this to be a place where people can safely get onto the taxi, private vehicle, or anything else? There's no signage indicating that that cyclists must stop. There's not even something as simple as a crosswalk that says stop for pedestrians in this area. In my submission, I have provided a number of solutions that I think could be easily implemented, and I offer them for Jacqueline's consideration. Next one, we talk about the transit loading zones. If you look closely, what besides the yellow band would tell you you have to stop for pedestrians getting onto and off of the buses. I see a big bike. That's all I see. Jacqueline had said that they have signage indicating you must stop for open doors. To be honest, I have seen it occasionally. It's a 6x6 sign way up on the right. Other than that, the only signs you'll see here are about cars must yield to bikes, this is a bike lane, everything else. Nothing about getting pedestrians safely across. For example, put in a simple zebra stripe and say cyclists must stop for pedestrians in the crosswalk. Do something simple. This is a bike lane, it's not a pedestrian amenity. Fourth one, I sound like an auctioneer up here. Oh well. This is the issue that's been, a number of people have spoken very passionately about, and I fully agree with them. The idea of street level versus sidewalk level, bikes are traffic. We need to consider them as traffic. High momentum vehicles that can seriously injure low momentum people. As I get older and fatter, I have more momentum, but still not enough for a cycle. I strongly would like to see some kind of explanation as to why this is justified. It's another example of transferring the risk from cyclists to pedestrians by allowing them to become part of the sidewalk. I have another example, but no time to get to it, so I will just go to my concluding remarks. Please don't get me wrong. Some projects, such as Richmond and Adelaide, are important and safe and excellently executed. They're also on the street. But I believe there are valid concerns here, and in my letter, which is very detailed, that need to be addressed, and Jacqueline, I'd be glad to talk about the solutions with you. I've made recommendations to Public Works, and they're included in my submission, that please expand the scope of this review, which I fully support, to include all the complaints, including mine. The other thing is, please look at process improvements that would see a comprehensive risk assessment that says, when we're doing this infrastructure project, here's what's changing with respect to cyclists, pedestrian safety, what's happening, what are we doing to mitigate it, how much will it cost, and I heard it as well, how are we going to monitor to see how it's working? If anybody wants to ask, I will tell them what staff told me when I asked what the monitoring on Sherbourne was like. I also suggest, in 5 seconds, that you ask Transportation Services or Waterfront to come back to you and give you a presentation on what does the pedestrian and cycling realm look like on the Eglinton Crosstown and at Queens Quay, and really get a chance to take a look at it through fresh eyes and say, does this make sense? Queens Quay has been extraordinarily contentious. I don't believe tweaking is necessary. I believe the design is just wrong. I believe that pedestrians should have crosswalks to get them safely from one sidewalk to the other across all traffic. Queens Quay has a crosswalk for cars and transit, and then you're left with a bike signal. What does that mean? What do I do? How
your
is someone
final
from
thought,
Latvia
please.
going to know what's happening?
Gord,
So
your final
I would suggest
thought.
that you do ask those two presentations to be made. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? And I see Monica's hand right up. Go ahead, Monica.
Thank you for coming in and expressing your concerns. I agree. Having been a cyclist in the past, I don't look up at signs. I'm looking down at the road because I'm looking for potholes, I'm looking for garbage cans, I'm looking for doors being opened, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody's going to be looking at a sign. They're going to be looking at the ground. So yes, absolutely, there should be stuff on the ground. They do have a solution on Queens Quay at Yonge that seems to be working in terms of the cyclists and the bus stop and everything else. So if you want to take a look at that intersection and use that as a bit of a model, they have an actual spot where cyclists get off the bike lane and stop and wait. And I believe there's enough signage there that they don't run over the pedestrians. And where the bus lets off, there is a crosswalk across the bike lane for the people to be able to get to the sidewalk.
Correct. The east side does it really well. There's curb separation.
Okay.
There's crosswalks. It's great. The west, they
Okay.
threw away the curb. So excellent point, and I saw that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's just a good example for someone to look at. And that's it, thanks.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay, Tracy?
So I agree with you, Gord, that there needs to be more attention paid to pedestrian safety with the various models, and I would definitely support incorporating your 2 points into the proposal.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gord. Councillor, we've concluded questions of staff. We have time for speakers now. If there's any motions, we can move them at this time as well. I'm going to invite, I'm also going to invite Nicole to comment. I specifically asked her if she can just provide some insight and reflect upon what Jacqueline has just presented. She is, after all, a specialist and a consultant to our group and a very valuable resource. So let's hear from her.
Thanks very much. So my point will be brief, but I would like to request that as an organization that the city change the language that we use when it comes to people getting in and out of accessible vehicles, and follow a model that the TTC uses by using the language of boarding and deboarding, so that loading might be reserved for things that are coming off on a dolly and not for people. Thanks.
Okay. So noted, we're all going to change our language here. Yes, Tracy.
Would this be an appropriate time to make a specific motion about including those points in the report? Is that needed?
Sure, we can do it at this time, or I could probably come up with another letter. This is the request to ensure that Eglinton, Crosstown, and Queens Quay is going to be reviewed. Is that correct?
No, it's more like assessment of other locations. It's more around getting input from everyone in terms of those.
Sure. Do you have language for that motion yet?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Do you want to read that out?
Sure.
And we're going to type it up afterwards.
Yeah, and I can give you this paper to make it easier. So I would like to move that the scope of the proposed cycle track review be increased to include assessment of other locations where other road users, for example, pedestrians, believe they've been placed at increased risk or inconvenience, including but not limited to all complaints received by transportation services to date and all input received for the April 8th, 2015 PWIC meeting, where this report was first proposed. And the second part to increase the scope is that assessment and recommendations for process improvements to ensure that future transportation services project reports to the public, Public Works and Infrastructure Committee and Council will explicitly disclose and rigorously address any safety or convenience impact on other road users, especially pedestrians.
Okay, great. So that's two separate motions, but taken together. Janice, our clerk, is going to come over and pick that up and properly type that up. Oh, you have it typed up. Do we already have this? Was it sent over? Okay, sure. Okay, so we're gonna get that typed up, and we're gonna get Tracy to sign it before we all vote on it. But I'm going to consider that as tabled, and perhaps what we can do is take a few other speakers before we come back and vote on that particular motion. And that'll give our clerk some time to type it. Councillor Carroll? She is a woman armed with an iPad. It's like,
I don't have a motion for here, because I don't know that it carries the weight coming from here. But I just wanted to note, and I guess in a way I'm putting Councillor Layton and Councillor Wong-Tam on notice, but going forward when we're dealing with the cycle strategy in the bigger standing committees like Works and such, this is a picture in Amsterdam. And, well, the sidewalk's wider and the bike lane's wider. The point is there are hardly any signs, and there's, you know, the curb is flush between the sidewalk and the bike lane. The difference is how the cyclists are cycling. Because we're looking at 100 years of cycling there, it's a whole different bike. And there's an understanding of speed. When you're in a busy place, you're going to cycle slower. And that, I think, is our biggest challenge in Toronto, is that we're making all these changes. I'm afraid to rent a Bixie and pedal down Sherbourne. My husband does it all the time, and when I join him, I find that I'm not a good enough cyclist to be on the cycling expressway of expert cyclists. And I said, why can't we all just be Amsterdammers and pedal with our backs upright and slowly, and everybody chill here? I think that's what's necessary when you make a major design change, and yet we have failed to figure out a way to make cyclists understand. You've made a major design change down on Queens Quay. And yet, the pent-up frustration of cyclists who had no lane and now have a beautiful brand-new lane, they're just flying past Harbourfront Theatre, and theatre patrons coming out or lunging into a bike lane that's close to the pedestrian crosswalk, like the one Gord just described, because they're not realizing a big change has taken place, and we've got to slow down and let everybody acclimatize themselves to this new changed roadway. And I think Gord is also right that putting signage at 6 feet or 6 meters high in the air isn't meaningful to cyclists either, because if you're trying to stay in the lane and you're trying not to bump into another cyclist who's passing you, I'm not looking up. I'm looking straight ahead of my front wheel of my bike, and which means I'm not looking way down the block and realizing that a block and a half away from here, I see someone in a wheelchair or a walker approaching the intersection I'm about to go flying through, even though it's against the light. So it's talking to cyclists about their behavior. We're going to give you more road to share as long as you remember you're sharing it. And while those motions probably don't get us a lot of the way here, I'm going to start to push on those in Public Works Committee and in design committees, that although we're trying to make it easier to understand signage because we're simplifying it and making less signage, we have to make it clear to cyclists that we're getting people used to changes. We're having to figure out as we go along, making refinements for the differently abled. We're trying to figure out how the pedestrians understand intersections, and you're going to have to slow down. We're actually asking cars to slow down to 30 kilometers an hour on every local road downtown, and on some of those roads, the bikes are going faster. I sometimes wonder as they go by that the G-forces aren't altering their facial makeup. And I think it's a time-specific thing. We're making a big transition in how we travel in downtown. So I think it's a temporary thing. I think in the future, you'll see people switching to that mode of bike. I've seen, more and more you see Amsterdammers with big baskets on the road. Those aren't mountain bikes and courier bikes. So I think you're going to see a change in behavior there, but I think as a city, we're going to have to push it along a bit so that people understand downtown high traffic cycling is not the same as getting on the Martin Goodman Trail and having a Sunday ride at top speed. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Carroll. I see Yin's hand to speak, and then Monica. Go ahead, Yin.
I'd like to know how today's recommendations from both the committee and Gord can be incorporated. Should we have a follow-up presentation on the bike, what do you call it, bicycle tracks or lane development, whether it's from Wellesley, Sherbourne, or Queens Quay and the Eglinton Crosstown?
So that's a question rather than just some comments. Jacqueline, do you want to just tell us what the next steps are and where this is going? I'm assuming it's going back to Pewick.
Right. At this point, we were bringing forward the scope of the review to seek feedback from this committee before we complete the review and bring our recommendations back to Pewick. I think given the discussion and our approach to seek feedback, we can certainly expand the scope around some of the issues that you've raised and that Gord Brown raised. But beyond Sherbourne and Wellesley, the issue of Queens Quay is really a whole nother issue with various other partners and various other issues to look at, that there's an active review going on by Waterfront Toronto on that. So what I would take at this moment would be we will expand the scope of this review to address the issues for Sherbourne and Wellesley that have been raised by this committee, so we can report back on that to Pewick.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Monica to speak.
I would like to suggest also that you bring in people with experience. I understand that this is about Sherbourne and Wellesley and we're focusing on Queens Quay a bit, but apparently the Civic Action Group, it's a not-for-profit. They were very integral in creating the Pan Am Path, which works so well at Yonge and Queens Quay. Are they being accessed, or I suggest they should be accessed for suggestions and things that they have learned in terms of bike paths and pedestrians?
Through you, Chair, we are actively involved in the delivery of the Pan Am Path with the partnership organization, so certainly we work with them closely.
Great, thank you very much. Any other members of the committee to speak? Seeing none, I do believe our motion is almost ready. Almost. Okay, maybe what I'll do is I'll provide a few comments, and then we'll bring the motion back onto the screen. We may consider reading it again for those who want us to read it out loud. Jacqueline, I want to thank you for coming forward and delivering your presentation. It's greatly appreciated that you are here before this committee. And I recognize that I'm the originator of why you're here, asking for a review of Sherbourne and Wellesley, the cycle tracks as they're known. I'm a firm believer that when we change designs, we actually do it with people in mind, and that means that we actually ask for feedback and ask for comments and evaluate experiential considerations along the way. That means that we don't just deploy the infrastructure or we redesign our roads and sidewalks and we leave it at that. This is why it's really important for us to continue to evaluate to ensure that all new infrastructure is working for everyone, to keep everyone safe, to allow mobility for those who are moving through our cities, whether on 2 feet or 2 wheels or 4 wheels or what have you, and everything in between, to make sure it works. And I know that there is ambitious plans to increase the cycling network in the City of Toronto, which I fully support as a cyclist as well. I also think that it's very important for us to stop and take a pause and evaluate, is it working the way we thought the infrastructure worked, and have we learned anything from that? So therefore, any new kilometers, and hopefully it will be kilometers, of new cycle tracks that are installed and constructed and placed into new neighborhoods and expanding communities, is that they take into consideration the learned experiences. I've heard a number of conflicts that have come up as a road user, either if I'm on a bicycle or I'm walking through a neighborhood, as a transit user and as a driver. And I agree. I think Councillor Carroll's observation is just bang on, is that we have a culture of travel that is in flux and changing in the city. And certainly I feel like I am even guilty of cycling, riding my bicycle far too fast at times. And today was a very good reminder just to slow down and be mindful that we are sharing the road. I also will acknowledge that I've actually moved to a commuter bike. I'm no longer on slicks, and my tires are much fatter with 2 baskets as I think through how do I be a part of work in the city, live in the city, play in the city, and not add adverse impact to anyone else. I learned a lot today in terms of hearing from members talk about shifting impact and perhaps safety concerns from cyclists over to pedestrians. That's not the intention of the cycle track, and I know that Jacqueline and her team are working really hard to try to resolve those conflicts with a lot of patience and I think certainly with a lot of rich feedback from this committee as well as those who are in the cycling community. I believe we will get there. I don't know if I actually spoke long enough to give you time to finish that motion. Okay, put it up anyways. I tried. Okay, so do we need to read this out loud again? Yes? Okay, so let's do that. So this is being moved by Tracy O'Dell. And Tracy, do you want me to read this, or would you like to read it? Okay, I'll read it. The manager of cycling infrastructure and programs transportation services be requested to consider the following: that the scope of the proposed cycle track review be increased to include assessment of other locations where other road users believe that they have been placed at increased risk or inconvenience, including but not limited to all complaints received by transportation services to date and all input received for the April 6, 2016 Public Works and Infrastructure Committee meeting where this report was first proposed. I think it's 2015. And then number 2, assessment and recommendations for process improvements to ensure that future transportation services projects reports to the public. You have 2 publics, the Public Works and Infrastructure Committee and Council, and explicitly disclose and rigorously address any safety or convenience impacts on the other road users, especially pedestrians. Okay, so we're going to tidy up a bit of the the spelling. Sorry, Councillor Carroll, you have a question of the mover?
Yes, I know this is out of order, but now that I'm seeing in print, in item number 2 of your motion, Tracy, you're not trying to suggest that we notify the Works Committee so that it's the difference between having a cycle track and not having a cycle track. What you're going after in that motion is making them more safe. You want them improved, not eliminated.
Well, safe for everybody.
Right.
That nobody's expendable.
Right. And I think that's clear, and I think we can advocate for that too, because there is the whole other argument of where people are just saying we can't have bike lanes because they're not safe. You're just saying have them and make them safe and improve them. Yeah, I appreciate that motion. Excellent.
The one, and so I guess if I could just speak, the one word I'm concerned about is in part 2 is convenience. Because often we can confuse convenience with, in such a, I don't know if I'm not explaining this correctly. Let me see if I can just track it back a little bit. The way that the second one, the word rigorously address any convenience issues, any change in the road is probably going to impact the convenience for one user or another, for a driver, for a pedestrian, either waiting a couple more seconds at a light. Even cyclists can be inconvenienced by cycling, by cycling routes, because all of a sudden they can't pass people or pass other cyclists that they might want to pass. And I'm of the cyclist that I've never ridden a speed bike. I'm kind of a cruiser, although my bike looks really flashy. I don't go very fast. No, but it's, so I worry that the rigorously address the convenience impacts may in fact now put us in a position where it's the convenience of other users of the road, and namely I'm actually thinking about drivers here rather than pedestrians, that any impact on convenience to another user could essentially freeze us in our tracks and say, we'll then revert to the no change option. I don't think that's the intention of it. I'm a little cautious that I don't want the Public Works Committee to get the feeling that that's what we're suggesting. That the convenience of drivers, for instance, should be paramount and shouldn't be impacted for the safety of cyclists.
So Councillor Layton, would it be advisable that if Tracy is agreeable as a friendly amendment, perhaps to remove the word convenience? I see the word inconvenience in the first recommendation as well, and I recognize that could be interpreted as a very tricky. It could be very contentious, and we all end up spending a lot of time focused on that one word as opposed to dealing with the bigger issue of making sure that the cycle tracks work for the cyclists and at the same time don't put pedestrians into harm's way. How do you feel about that, Tracy?
I feel comfortable with the friendly amendment. I guess by convenience, I'm thinking in terms of accessibility and convenience in the points that people were raising about being dropped off, around the corner or like far away. So some people might call that convenience. Some of us would call that accessibility. So that's what the word was.
I see hands going up, but before I acknowledge those hands, so Councillor Layton, I think you have an agreement here from Tracy that she could probably remove that word, and still the essence of the motion, the intention of the motion not be changed.
I think also you could substitute it for accessibility impacts as well. I think that may better describe it, so that the convenience for drivers to park right in front of the Starbucks isn't what we're talking about here. The convenience of people to get out of a vehicle and safely get to where they're going, so that they don't have to walk across the corner, hop through 3 hoops, and I don't know, travel up and down an expressway on-ramp. That's what's meant. So maybe that simple change would certainly put my mind at ease.
Yes.
That they won't get confused over what the intention is here.
I like the fact that you're quick on your feet. So it sounds like we may have a resolution for the second portion. On the first portion, it has the word inconvenience. Can everyone live with that, or is this something that also needs to be addressed? So I'll read it again. Assessment of other locations where other road users believe they have been placed at increased risk or inconvenience. Before you speak, Terry Lynn, I just want to, and I recognize that we're kind of doing this in such a manner, and there's hands that are going up all over the place. I don't want to not acknowledge you, but if there's a way that we can craft a solution here, your hands may go down. You're trying to help, okay. So Melissa, help us out here.
I think what Tracy might be trying to get at with the inconvenience piece is the respect. It's kind of a respect thing, a respect that we all use the road, and maybe that's kind of the word that's missing. Because when I think about my experience as a pedestrian in my chair, over time, the people in my community have kind of acknowledged that there's people in chairs on the sidewalk in the 5 years that I've lived there, and will actually call other people out when they're doing inappropriate things like cutting me off. So maybe it's more of a respect kind of acknowledgement of,
That wasn't what I had in mind, actually.
No?
But I appreciate the principle. Maybe if it was at increased risk or,
Or inaccessibility?
yeah, barred from accessibility or denied accessibility or something like that.
Yeah.
Would that work?
I think if it was increased risk or inaccessibility, including but not limited to.
I actually don't read the same thing in the first one. I think assessing inconvenience isn't the same as rigorously addressing the convenience. The first one didn't concern me. I'm happy to vote for that, but just because it's about assessing an inconvenience, inconvenience.
Okay.
I don't know if they mean exactly the opposite thing in those two contexts. I
It
don't know.
sounds like there may not be any request to change the language in portion number 1. Okay, so the second portion has now been modified, and it's to address safety or accessibility impacts on other road users. If there are no more questions or comments, I think we're ready to vote on this. And to thank Jacqueline for her presentation. We know that this is not the last time that we'll be seeing you here. I think you heard loud and clear from the committee that we welcome you to come back. Okay. All in favor of the amended motion? Okay, and so passed. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got a couple of last items, but they're very important. And so we're now moving to 4.1, the review of the recruitment process and new term of the Disability Access and Inclusion Advisory Committee. We do have Nicole who's ready to do a presentation for us. Short one, but.
Thank you. So the Disability Access and Inclusion Advisory Committee, I'm not sure if people are comfortable with it being shortened to say something like DAAC, so that I don't have to say all 5 words every time. It's a mouthful. So the notice has been posted on the city's public appointments notice page, and I wanted to confirm that you've all received the notification via email from me as well. We do hope that you'll be reapplying for the upcoming term. To advertise the opportunity, we conducted an outreach to over 30 agencies that support people with disabilities and asked them to notify employees and consumers through their communication channels about this opportunity. Clerk's office has also provided support. They'll be tweeting via their handle @Toronto Council, which has over 24,000 followers. They use this handle to tweet other public notices, so people would be accustomed to receiving this information through that Twitter feed. I was wondering if the group would like to have a quick run-through of the organizations that have been contacted so far, in case there's any that have been missed. Is that something that you feel would benefit? Okay. So I'll read through this list. These are the organizations that I've personally done the outreach with: Arch Disability Law Center, Bob Rumble Association for the Deaf, Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, Canadian Hearing Society, Canadian Mental Health Association, Toronto Chapter, Canadian National Institute for the Blind, Citizens with Disabilities Ontario, Communication Disabilities Access Canada, Community Head Injury Resource Services, Community Living, Community Living Toronto, Down Syndrome Association of Toronto, Easter Seals Ontario, and Extend a Family, Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario, March of Dimes, Margaret's Housing and Community Support, Meta Centre, Multiple Sclerosis Society of Canada, Muscular Dystrophy Canada, Ontario Federation of Cerebral Palsy, Scatting Court Community Centre, Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus Association, Spinal Cord Injury Ontario, the Marshall Forest Centre, and Variety Village. A few others were contacted additionally, but they did not respond to the request to share information through their groups. So when we're finished the presentation, I would encourage, if I've missed any that you think that should be included, I would like to hear from them. Also with us today, Matt Cowley introduced himself earlier. Matt's the Public Appointments Secretariat in the City Clerk's office, and he's going to let us know about the numbers so far, and that this is the first time that the city's applications process is being used for our DAYAC committee applications.
Thank you, Nicole. Just to add to what you're saying, as Nicole mentioned, I work in the City Clerk's office, and I work with a team of staff who assist with public appointments to all the city's boards of their agencies and corporations. What we're doing in this case is because about 11 months ago we rolled out a new website with a fairly clean and user-friendly online application system for these various city boards. Nicole's office asked if we could use that same template for applications for this committee, now that we have this website up and running, so of course we said yes. So what our office is doing is just supporting that process, so supporting the intake of the applications. The rest of the selection and appointments process for this committee remains the same. So we posted the online application, I believe it was the end of the day on September 15th, and the deadline for people to apply, as I'm sure you all know, of course, for this current round of appointments is October 20th, so that's about 3 weeks away. Once the deadline is passed, we will hand all the applications over to Nicole's team for the rest of the selection process to continue. As of this morning, before I came downstairs, we had, I believe, 13 applications received so far. As you know, there are 12 public spots on the committee. So, of course, with 3 weeks left, as Nicole mentioned, she's been doing quite a bit of outreach, and our office is also going to do what we can through the Toronto Council Twitter account and other networks we have. And if people have other suggestions, of course, for outreach for either of us, we're always happy to hear those, and we always want to do what we can to improve our outreach and communication. And similarly, if people have any questions about the actual application or about the format, or if people have any issues with the application, there's a number of staff in our office who are happy to answer any questions or give any assistance that people might need in completing that application process. We've done a number of updates in the past year to try and make our online site as accessible as possible, and we've had some good advice from for example, for some visually impaired members of the public who gave us some good feedback on how to improve that. But if there's other things we can do, of course, we want to know about it, and we'll be happy to make any changes we can.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Are there any questions to the staff regarding their presentation? No? Okay. So keep up the good work. Everybody, please circulate the posting as widely as possible. We want to see lots of great candidates come forward. This is a committee that does very good work. And it's an important voice within the City of Toronto. I will just move to receive the report. All in favor? Okay, thank you very much. And our last item is the review of the City of Toronto's Accessibility Symposium. There's a quick staff presentation. And if those who need to leave early, my apologies that we're not getting this done quicker, but we're almost there.
Thank you. So each year, the Equity, Diversity, and Human Rights Division, since its origin in 2011, has hosted Employee Learning Conference in partnership with other divisions. In 2014, for example, the topic was Aboriginal inclusion. On the morning of the 26th of October, our division will be hosting an Employee Learning Conference in partnership with Toronto Employment and Social Services and Corporate Learning and Leadership Development. It will take place at the Chestnut Conference Center in City Hall, or near City Hall. And this year, our aim is to increase our capacity to attract and recruit, evaluate, and hire more candidates with disabilities. Our attendance goal this year is 200 City of Toronto employees that are human resources professionals and hiring managers. We're in the process of finalizing the agenda. At this point in time, we have some great keynote speaker. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Jeff Preston. Jeff Preston did an excellent presentation. Well, I've heard him speak many times, but he was recently speaking at the Guelph Accessibility Conference in the spring. And his presentation will be addressing seeing disability and reframing accommodation in a post-AODA Ontario. The goal for this presentation, we wanted to create a shift in awareness, because a lot of the times when people don't know people with disabilities already, they may be likely to make a lot of assumptions, and Jeff's specialty is in media and media awareness, so to be able to help raise the awareness of the fact that a lot of the times our assumptions about people with disabilities are informed by other sources such as media. So that will be an exciting presentation. We're also looking forward to having the video called A Higher Awareness that was developed by NDM, which is the National Disability Employment Awareness Month organization. That's with Bob Santos from Link Up Employment Services. It's a very dynamic video. It has some amazing speakers from the employer side of things and from the employee side of the conversation, challenging myths that are very common. The next thing that will be part of the agenda is a panel of people with disabilities, speaking from the perspective of employees and candidates, and what works for them and what their recommendations are to the audience, and how they can do a better job in recruiting and interviewing people with different abilities. We'll also have a panel of different employer presentations. So we're looking forward to potentially a presentation from somebody at the City of Toronto, as well as Bell Canada, Iron Mountain, and possibly IBM. They'll be talking about some of their different initiatives, some of the successes and things that they've learned along the way that can help the City of Toronto be able to take some of these ideas as we go forward and support our goals to increase diversity. We hope to also include a brief demonstration of some assistive software technology, and that will be a very action-packed half-day. Some of the things that are still to be determined about the event will be some ideas about what those panelist questions should be that can help steer the conversation in a way that we uncover challenges with people, the myths and assumptions that people make, as well as learning, answering some questions that people have about accommodations. And so I certainly would be interested to hear from people either now or by email when you have a chance, if you have some ideas about that.
All right.
It's on October 26th, Monday, October 26th in the morning.
Yeah. Monica, questions?
How do people register and how much does it cost?
It's a free, pardon me, it's a free event specifically for City of Toronto employees.
Oh.
We want to take the initiative. First of all, we would love to have an event in the future that's open to the public, that's geared towards BIAs, agencies, boards, corporations, and community centers. There are a lot of other groups that we want to share this with, but we felt that the first priority was to make sure that as a corporation, the city is capable of implementing the requirements of the AODA successfully. And once we have experienced, running our first symposium this way, then we'll be looking to, for funding in order to be able to do something that's public, so the city can have a leadership position with the communities as well.
Any other questions? Stephanie?
It's connected but not specific to the event. I think the event is great. I'm really glad that you're having it. My question is more of around the city's actual hiring and recruitment policies and practices. Are the topics at the event born out of policies that have already been changed and created to match the AODA, or is the city looking at policy change to incorporate recruitment processes and practices that promote equitable hiring?
Well, the city's policies are always under discussion when, when we get feedback. For example, we were recently having conversations with HR and legal in line with some of the requirements of the AODA with respect to providing notice in job postings and providing notice in job offer contracts and at those different stages. This event specifically is not geared towards educating the staff about the policies as much as it is about creating the beginning stages of creating an attitudinal shift and raising awareness about the capabilities of candidates with disabilities.
Thank you very much. Yin, you have questions?
I think I just want to ensure that all disabilities, of course, especially people with sight impairment, our concerns are addressed. Therefore, information and communication accessibility is very important, and that the presenters or any presentations and workshops or panel is conducted to model accessible presentation style, and that can be looked. Some guidelines can be is on the. I think Accessible Campus. At least I've seen that on that website. So I just want to make sure that the symposium actually is conducted in an accessible way, especially for sight impaired people.
Absolutely.
Melissa.
I just had a really quick question. So this is voluntary, whether they come to this or not, or is it mandated?
It's voluntary.
Yeah. One of the questions if you're put questions forward before people register, is invite people to think about how this impacts whatever department or area they work in. Because I think people that know that it impacts their area might be more interested than people that haven't thought about it before. I don't know if that's something you already thought of.
I'm not sure if I fully understood the question. In our registration process for the event, we did ask people questions about their current knowledge and confidence levels so that we can get also some questions about their learning objectives for the event, so we can get a sense for if they have, when we do follow-up after the event, to find out if their learning objectives were met, and also to do a longer-term follow-up after the event to see if the learning from the event had traction and if they still have retained what they were receiving.
Okay.
Does that help to answer the question?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. I would like to move to, sorry, sir, we're just on this item, and I can acknowledge you in a second. If there's no further questions regarding this matter and those speakers sorry, Terry Lynn, to speak or to ask questions?
I'm to speak or to...
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I wanted to note that on this committee previously, folks have pushed for the city to keep better stats of who they're hiring, especially in relation to disability. So I'm wondering if that can somehow work its way into the conference, or how that would happen, because it's not currently happening.
Okay, Nicole is taking notes. I think she's going to bring that back and reflect upon it. If there are no further speakers from the committee on this item, I'm just going to move to receive the report. It's very good work. I'm very excited the symposium is going to be here. I know that Mayor Tory has been very keen to see the symposium take place, and there is obviously a desire to make sure that we can do some follow-up work with the broader public audience. But this is a first great place for us to start, especially if the City of Toronto wants to be that model corporation employer. So all hands up to receive the report. Thank you very much. I will say that we've concluded our first agenda items post-summer. It was a very full meeting. There are no other items for us to discuss. Can I get a motion to adjourn the meeting? Okay. So sorry, sir. There's nothing before us for you to speak to. I'm happy to stay behind to have a conversation with you. Sir, this is not. Yeah, I'm happy to stay behind and we can have a conversation, but the members here, some of them have Wheel-Trans, I'll be waiting for them at 12 o'clock, they're already late, so I need to let the committee go, but I can stay behind you. I'm sorry, sir. Sorry, sir. We're going to need to adjourn the meeting. Can I get a motion to adjourn the meeting, please? Okay, I'm looking at Terry Lynn. Thank you very much. And meeting is adjourned. I will stay behind and we can have a